9-year-old boy spends every night watching over his baby sister in her crib and refuses to leave. Intrigued, the mother decides to install a camera in the room and discovers something that makes her blood run cold. The digital clock on Sophie's dresser cast a soft blue glow across the darkened nursery, its numbers marking another hour, 2:17 a.m. Thomas sat cross-legged on the floor beside his sister's crib, his Batman pajamas wrinkled from hours of stillness. His back pressed against the wall, head tilted slightly to maintain his view of both the window and Sophie's peaceful sleeping form. The steady rhythm of her breathing had long ago become his lullaby. Though he fought against its hypnotic pull, 9 years old and already carrying the weight of the world on his narrow shoulders, dark circles had taken up permanent residence beneath his eyes, aging his boyish face. His teachers would notice them tomorrow just as they had yet yesterday, and the day before they'd whisper their concerns to each other in the staff room, share worried glances when he dozed off during math class. But Thomas didn't care. They didn't understand. Nobody did. The sound of soft footsteps in the hallway made him tense, his mother doing another of her midnight checks. The door creaked open, and Emma Baker's exhausted face appeared in the gap. "Tommy," she whispered, using the nickname he'd recently declared himself too old for, "sweetheart. Please, you need to sleep in your own bed." Thomas shook his head, a gesture so slight it was barely perceptible in the darkness. "I'm okay here." Emma pushed the door wider, padding into the room in her oversized MIT sweatshirt and plaid pajama pants. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, stray strands falling around her face. She looked as tired as Thomas felt the strain of single parenthood etched into the PRUR lines around her eyes. "This isn't healthy," she said. Crouching beside him, her hand found his shoulder warm and comforting. "You're exhausted. Mrs. Reynolds called today. She says you fell asleep during your presentation." It wasn't important anyway. Thomas mumbled, though the memory of his classmate Snickers still stung. He'd worked hard on that presentation about the solar system, staying up late to paint his model of Jupiter's storms. But that was before. Before everything changed, Emma sighed, the sound heavy with helplessness. "Tommy, Dad wouldn't want." "Don't." The word came out sharper than he intended, making Sophie stir in her crib. Both mother and son held their breath until she settled again, tiny fingers clutching her yellow blanket. Emma tried a different approach. "What if we moved your bed in here? Just for a little while," but Thomas knew better. Temporary solutions had a way of becoming permanent, like the casseroles that still appeared on their doorsteps 6 months after the funeral, like the sympathy cards that kept arriving, like the grief counselor's weekly visits that never seemed to end. "I need to stay here," he insisted, voice barely above a whisper. "I need to watch for what, sweetheart?" The question hung in the air unanswered. How could he explain what he didn't fully understand himself? The shadows that seemed deep than they should be, the sounds that didn't belong to their old house's normal creaks, and settle the feeling that crept up his spine whenever he looked out Sophie's window at night, instead of answering. Thomas reached up to adjust Sophie's blanket, where it had slipped down his sister's sigh in her sleep. A contented sound that made his chest ache with fierce protectiveness. She was so small, so defenseless, she wouldn't remember their father's laugh or how he used to sing horrible off-key renditions of Beatles songs while making pancakes on Sunday mornings. She wouldn't remember anything at all, unless Thomas made sure she had the chance to grow up and make new memories. Emma watched this tender gesture, her heart breaking all over again. After a long moment, she leaned in and pressed a kiss to Thomas's forehead. "Just try to rest a little, okay? Even if you stay here, lean back against the wall and close your eyes. Please?" Thomas nodded, not meeting her gaze. They both knew he wouldn't sleep. He hadn't really slept in weeks. "I love you," Emma whispered, standing with the stiff movements of someone much older than her, 34 years. "Both of you love you too, Mom." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Thomas alone with his vigil once more. Outside, a car drove past, its headlights sweeping across the ceiling in slow motion. Thomas tracked their movement, counting the seconds until darkness returned in her crib. Sophie made a small sound, and he automatically reached through the bars to touch her hand, offering comfort. Even in sleep, the digital clock changed 2:23 a.m. 7 minutes since he'd last checked. The night stretched ahead, long and dark and full of unknowns, But Thomas wouldn't move. He couldn't not when he was the only one who noticed the car that drove by their house too often, or the shadow that sometimes lingered too long beneath. Sophie's window, not when he was the only one who understood that the monsters weren't just in fairy tales anymore. He shifted slightly, trying to find a more comfortable position against the wall. His eyelids felt like they were made of lead, but he forced them to stay open. The night wasn't over yet, and Thomas had promises to keep. Promises he'd made to himself, to Sophie, and to a father who would never come home again. The clock ticked on 2:24 a.m. Just another night in the Baker household, where a 9-year-old boy waged a silent war against exhaustion, and the shadows seemed to watch and wait and grow. The autumn wind rattled the branches against Sophie's window, creating shadows that danced across the nursery walls. Thomas watched them with growing unease, trying to distinguish natural movement from something more sinister. It was just past midnight, and the street outside had fallen into its usual suburban silence, broken only by the occasional passing car. But this car wasn't passing. It had been parked across the street for the last hour, its dark outline barely visible through the gauzy curtains. Thomas had counted. This was the 4th night this week. He'd seen it always between midnight and 3 a.m. Always in slightly different spots, but always with a clear view of their house. Mrs. Reynolds' words from earlier that day echoed in his head. "Thomas, this is the 3rd time this week you've fallen asleep in class. If this continues, I'll have no choice voice." But to schedule a parent-teacher conference, she'd handed him back his science test. The red D Stark against the white paper he'd used to love science, used to dream about being an astronaut or a marine biologist. Now those dreams seemed as distant as the stars he could barely see through Sophie's window. A floorboard creaked in the hallway, and Thomas tensed. But it was just their elderly golden retriever Cooper, making his nightly rounds. The dog padded into the nursery, his graying muzzle and gentle eyes appearing in the dim light. He made his way to Thomas, settling down beside him with a soft whimper. "Good boy," Thomas whispered, scratching behind Cooper's ears. "You feel it too, don't you? Something's not right." The dog's ears perked up, suddenly his head turning toward the window. Thomas followed his gaze, breath catching in his throat. There a shadow moving across the front lawn, too deliberate to be cast by the swaying trees. Cooper let out a low growl so quiet it was almost inaudible. Thomas reached for his mother's old iPhone, the one she'd given him for emergencies after Dad died. Though it could only connect to Wi-Fi, his hands trembled as he opened the camera app, trying to capture evidence of what he was seeing. But by the time he raised the phone, the shadow had disappeared. The car across the street started its engine. Thomas scrambled to his feet, careful not to wake Sophie. He pressed his face against the window, using his hands to block out the room's reflection. The vehicle moved slowly down their street, a dark sedan, its make and model obscured by the night. No distinctive features except his heart nearly stopped. There was something wrong with the license plate. It was covered or altered somehow, making it impossible to read. That wasn't normal. That wasn't someone who just happened to park on their street. Cooper whined again, pressing against Thomas's leg, outside the sedan, turned the corner and vanished. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that it would be back. They always came back. A soft cry from the crib pulled his attention away from the window. Sophie was stirring her small face, scrunching up in what might be the beginning of tears. Thomas moved quickly to her side, reaching through the bars to stroke her hair the way Mom did. It's okay," he whispered. "Your big brother's here. Nothing bad's going to happen to you. I promise." Sophie settled under his touch, her features relaxing back into peaceful sleep. Thomas envied her innocence, her ability to find comfort so easily. He couldn't remember the last time he'd slept without jerking awake at every sound, every shadow. The digital clock read 12:47 a.m. When Thomas heard his mother's laptop whirring to life in her home office down the hall, she'd been taking on extra freelance work lately, trying to make up for everything. The familiar sound of her typing provided a strange comfort, a reminder that he wasn't the only one awake in the house. He returned to his spot against the wall, Cooper lying faithful beside him. The dog's presence made him feel a little braver, a little less alone in his vigilance. Thomas pulled out his notebook, the one he'd started keeping. 3 weeks ago when he first noticed the car with trembling hands. He recorded the time, the description of the vehicle, and the shadow he'd seen the entries were starting to fill. Pages, October 15th. Dark sedan tinted windows parked from 1:20 to 2:45 a.m. October 17th. Same car, different spot, midnight, 2:15 a.m. October 19th. Footsteps in the garden below window. In the garden below. Cooper barked. Car left quickly. Today's entry would be the longest yet. Thomas wrote carefully, determined to document every detail if something happened. If someone finally believed him, he wanted there to be proof that he hadn't imagined it all. A sudden gust of wind sent the trees into a frenzy of movement, their shadows writhing on the walls like living things. Cooper's head snapped up, ears forward, listening to something Thomas couldn't hear. The boy held his breath, pen frozen mid-air. There it was again, a sound that didn't belong. Not the wind, not the trees, not the house settling. It was the soft crunch of footsteps on fallen leaves directly below Sophie's window. Thomas clutched his phone, thumb hovering over the emergency call button. Cooper's growl was louder now, rumbling deep in his chest. Sophie stirred again, but didn't wake. The footsteps moved slowly across the lawn, accompanied by a new sound. The quiet click of what might have been a camera shutter. Thomas's hand shook as he tried to steady his phone, desperate to capture proof. But all he could see through the window was darkness, broken occasionally by the beam of a flashlight sweeping across their front yard. When morning came, he knew what would happen. Mom would check the yard and find nothing. The police would drive by and see nothing suspicious. His teachers would attribute his exhaustion to grief, his paranoia to trauma. But Thomas knew what he'd seen, what he'd heard. He pulled his knees to his chest, one hand still clutching the phone while backpack, and headed for the door. He couldn't shake the feeling that his mother was wrong. Dangerously so. The school day passed in a blur of half-listened lectures and restless fidgeting. Thomas sat at his desk, doodling in the margins of his notebook. Black cars, shadowy figures, and windows with curtains drawn too tightly. His teacher droned on about fractions, but all Thomas could think about was Nash's smile. Polished, practiced, and just a little too perfect. It lingered in his mind like an itch he couldn't scratch. When the final bell rang, Thomas bolted from class, his feet carrying him home faster than usual. The streets were quiet, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across lawns still damp from morning dew. As he approached his house, he slowed, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene before him. Nash's BMW gleamed in the driveway next door, its surface reflecting the sunlight like a mirror. Across the street, Cooper barked sharply, startling a flock of birds into flight. Inside, Emma was folding laundry in the living room while Sophie played nearby with blocks. Nash wasn't there, not yet, but his presence seemed to hang in the air, heavy and suffocating. "Hey, buddy," Emma greeted, glancing up briefly before returning to her task. "How was school?" Thomas shrugged, dropping his backpack by the couch. He wandered toward the window, peering out at Nash's house. The man himself was nowhere to be seen, but the sight of the BMW made his stomach churn. "You okay?" Emma asked, noticing the tension in his posture. "You seem off." "I'm fine," Thomas muttered, though his voice betrayed him. He turned away from the window, avoiding her gaze. "Where's Cooper?" "He went outside a few minutes ago, probably chasing squirrels or something." Thomas nodded absently, his thoughts racing. Cooper had been acting strange ever since Nash moved in. More alert, more protective. And now, with Nash offering to babysit Sophie? Something didn't sit right. Not at all. Later that evening, after dinner and bath time, Sophie drifted off to sleep, her tiny chest rising and falling rhythmically beneath her favorite blanket. Thomas crept into her room, closing the door softly behind him. The faint glow of a nightlight illuminated the space, casting soft shadows over the crib and changing table. Kneeling down, he retrieved the hidden notebook and flipped it open to the latest entry. October 22nd. Robert Nash moves in across the street. Black BMW in driveway, same make as night car. Camera clicks continue, footsteps heard near property line last night. He hesitated, pen hovering over the page. Then, in smaller letters, he added, "Nash offered to watch Sophie. Mom said yes. Doesn't she see?" A low whine from the doorway startled him. Cooper stood there, ears perked and tail stiff, staring intently at the window. Thomas followed his gaze, heart pounding. Outside, the silhouette of a man moved slowly along the edge of their yard. Too far away to identify, but close enough to send chills down Thomas's spine. "Cooper," he whispered, motioning for the dog to stay quiet. Together, they watched as the figure paused, glanced towards Sophie's window, and then disappeared into the darkness. Thomas clenched his fists, anger bubbling beneath the surface. How could his mom not see what was happening? To her, Nash was just a friendly neighbor, a convenient babysitter. But to Thomas, he was something else entirely. A predator, lurking in plain sight. The next morning, Thomas cornered Emma in the kitchen before she could leave for work. "Mom, please don't let him near Sophie," he pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice. "Please trust me on this." Emma sighed, setting her coffee mug down. "Tommy, I know you're scared. Losing Dad has been hard on all of us. But Nash is just trying to help. We can't live our lives afraid of every shadow." "But what if the shadows are real?" Thomas countered, his voice trembling. "What if I'm not imagining things?" For a moment, Emma looked torn, her maternal instincts warring with her desire to believe in goodness. Finally, she knelt down, placing a hand on his shoulder. "If anything feels wrong, if anything happens, you tell me immediately, okay? Promise me that." Thomas nodded reluctantly, though he knew promises wouldn't stop Nash. Only action would. As the days passed, Thomas became more vigilant, documenting every detail. The times Nash left his house, the license plate partially obscured by mud, the subtle changes in Cooper's behavior. He even started sketching maps of their neighborhood, marking spots where he'd heard footsteps or seen movement in the dead of night. One evening, as twilight settled over the street, Thomas noticed Nash standing in his front yard again, talking on the phone. This time, however, he wasn't alone. A second man stood beside him, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing dark sunglasses despite the fading light. They exchanged words Thomas couldn't hear, their body language tense and deliberate. Cooper growled low in his throat, hackles raised. Thomas placed a calming hand on the dog's back, his pulse quickening. Something big was coming. He could feel it. That night, as Sophie slept peacefully upstairs, Thomas sat cross-legged on his bedroom floor, surrounded by pages of notes and sketches. His eyes darted between the window and the clock, waiting for the inevitable sound of tires rolling onto the street. When it came, he grabbed his flashlight and tiptoed to Sophie's room, positioning himself where he could see both the driveway and Nash's house. The black BMW parked silently across the street, its engine cutting off with a soft click. Nash stepped out, glancing around cautiously before heading toward their gate. Thomas held his breath, gripping the flashlight tighter. This was it, the moment he'd been preparing for. Whatever happened next, he vowed to protect his family, no matter the cost. Because in the end, it wasn't just about shadows or whispers. It was about keeping Sophie safe. And Thomas would do whatever it took to ensure that promise stayed true. Backpack and headed downstairs. He couldn't shake the image of Nash standing in their kitchen, his perfect smile never quite reaching his eyes, his gaze always returning to Sophie's window above. He couldn't forget how Cooper, who loved everyone, had stayed pressed against Thomas's legs, silent and watchful outside. Nash was getting into his BMW. The car purred to life, the sound Thomas had heard too many times in the dead of night as they passed each other on the driveway. Nash gave him another smile. "See you around, Thomas," he called, and somehow it sounded like a promise. Emma's fingers hovered over the laptop keyboard. The security camera interface opened before her. The installation had cost more than she could really afford. But Thomas's behavior had left her no choice. The small camera, now discreetly mounted in the corner of Sophie's nursery, offered a clear view of the entire room, including the window that seemed to occupy so much of her son's attention. The clock on her desk read 11:42 p.m. Through the video feed, she could see Thomas in his usual spot sitting against the wall beside Sophie's crib. He was talking softly, though the camera's microphone barely picked up his whispers. Just need to stay awake a little longer. He murmured more to himself than to his sleeping sister. Can't let them get close to you. Emma adjusted the volume, straining to hear more. Them, he kept using that word. But who were they? The therapist had suggested that Thomas was creating imaginary threats to process his grief, giving shape to the formless fear of loss that had haunted him since his father's death. There's someone out there. Thomas's voice came through clearer now. I see them watching every night. They come closer. A chill ran down Emma's spine despite her rational mind's protests. She switched to the exterior camera view, scanning the front yard. Nothing seemed out of place yet. She squinted at the screen. There by the garden beneath Sophie's window was that a footprint in her freshly mulched flower bed. Emma zoomed in, her heart beginning to race. The impression was clear. Someone had stood there recently enough that the morning dew hadn't softened the edges. It's probably just the gardener, she whispered to herself. But she knew that wasn't true. They hadn't had a gardener since David died. She'd been doing all the yard work herself. Movement on the nursery camera drew her attention back to the interior feed. Thomas had gone to the window, pressing his face close to the glass. His posture was tense, alert like Cooper. When he sensed something wrong, Mom never checks the garden, right? He said softly to Sophie. They know when to come. They know when she's too tired to look properly. Emma opened her desk drawer, pulling out the small notebook she'd started keeping. Her own observations meant to track Thomas's behavior for his therapist now held a different kind of record. 10th 21st, Sophie's favorite stuffed elephant missing from crib found in bushes below window. 1023, muddy smudge on exterior windowsill. No rain in past week. 1025th, motion light battery. Dead was changed last month. Small things easy to explain away, but seeing them listed together made her stomach twist with unease. On the screen, Thomas had returned to his spot by the crib. Sophie stirred in her sleep, and he reached through the bars to gentle her, humming the lullaby David used to sing. The sound made Emma's eyes burn with tears. A soft thud from outside made her jump through the exterior camera. She watched Cooper race across the yard, barking at something or someone just out of frame. By the time she switched to the other camera angle, whatever had disturbed him was gone, but there was something new in the garden. Emma zoomed in, her hands shaking slightly as the image cleared there, half buried in the mulch, as if dropped in haste. A small silver camera memory card. She looked back at the nursery feed. Thomas was staring directly at the camera, now his expression both vindicated and afraid. He knew she was watching. Knew she was finally beginning to see what he'd been trying to tell them all along. Mrs. Baker. Thomas's voice came through the speaker, formal and serious in a way no 9-year-old should sound. I think you should check the garden in the morning. Really check it this time. Emma closed her notebooks, her throat tight. In the morning. She would call the police again in the morning. She would document everything properly in the morning. She would finally start taking her son's fears seriously. But for now, she opened another window on her laptop, bringing up the footage from the past week. She had hours of watching ahead of her, searching for whatever Thomas had seen in the dark, whatever had turned her brave, brilliant boy into a sleepless guardian outside. Cooper had settled beneath Sophie's window, his low growl a constant warning in the night above him. Thomas maintained his vigil, his small face pale in the camera's infrared glow, and somewhere in the darkness beyond their home, someone watched, waited, and left traces too small for adults to notice, but not too small for a brother's watchful eyes. Mrs. Baker, we believe Thomas needs more help than we can provide at school. Emma sat rigid in the hard plastic chair, clutching her purse in her lap across the desk. Mrs. Peterson, the school counselor, shuffled through a folder of concerning incidents behind her. Thomas's homeroom teacher. Mrs. Reynolds nodded in solemn agreement. His latest art project was troubling. Mrs. Peterson slid a drawing across the desk. Dark crayon strokes depicted a house with ominous shadows lurking outside. A figure stood at a window watching a small bed. He's exhibiting signs of acute anxiety and possible paranoid ideation. Emma stared at the drawing, remembering the memory card she'd found. Eyes. The night was thick with shadows, the kind that seemed to stretch and twist in ways they shouldn't. Thomas sat cross-legged on the floor of his bedroom, his flashlight clutched tightly in one hand and his notebook open beside him. The house was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator downstairs and the occasional creak of old wood settling. Everyone else was asleep. Sophie tucked safely into her bed, Emma resting after another long day. But Thomas remained vigilant. He had promised himself he wouldn't let his guard down, not even for a second. Through the thin curtains, the glow of Nash's house across the street was still visible. Lights flickered softly behind drawn blinds, casting strange shapes onto the pavement. Thomas narrowed his eyes, focusing on every detail. He knew better than to trust appearances. Nash had mastered the art of blending in, of making people believe he was harmless. But Thomas saw through it all. The carefully curated facade, the calculated smiles, the lies wrapped in niceties. His notebook was filled with observations, scribbled hastily but deliberately. License plate numbers, camera types, times Nash left or returned home, patterns in his behavior. Each entry was a piece of evidence, proof that something wasn't right. Yet no matter how many times he presented his findings, the adults dismissed him. They called it grief, trauma, an overactive imagination. To them, he was just a scared little boy trying to make sense of losing his father. But Thomas knew better. This wasn't about Dad. It was about Sophie and Nash. He flipped to a fresh page, jotting down tonight's date. Then, underlining it twice for emphasis, he wrote, Nash came back at 10:47 p.m., car lights off. Walked around the side of our house, stayed near Sophie's window for exactly 3 minutes. How did he know? Because Thomas had been watching. Always watching. Earlier that evening, while Nash thought everyone was asleep, Thomas had crept downstairs and stationed himself by the living room window. Through binoculars borrowed from Emma's closet, he'd seen Nash move like a shadow along the edge of their property. The man carried something, a small device, maybe another memory card, and paused beneath Sophie's window. For those agonizing 3 minutes, Thomas held his breath, his fingers gripping the binoculars so tightly they left marks on his palms. When Nash finally retreated, slipping back toward his own house, Thomas exhaled sharply, his heart pounding. Now, sitting alone in the dark, he replayed the scene in his mind, dissecting every movement, every detail. Nash hadn't looked around to check if anyone was watching. He didn't think a child would notice. But Thomas noticed everything. A soft knock on his door startled him. Thomas? It was Emma, her voice gentle but tinged with concern. Are you still awake? He quickly closed his notebook and shoved it under his pillow. Yeah, he replied, keeping his tone neutral. Just thinking. Emma stepped inside, her silhouette framed by the dim hallway light. She hesitated before sitting on the edge of his bed. Doctor, Carter said it might take some time for you to feel comfortable sharing your feelings. That's okay. We're here to help you, sweetheart. Thomas stared at her, frustration bubbling beneath the surface. Didn't she understand? This wasn't about feelings. It was about facts, about protecting Sophie. But arguing wouldn't change anything. So instead, he nodded silently, letting her believe she'd gotten through to him. When she left, closing the door softly behind her, Thomas retrieved his notebook and resumed his watch. Outside, the world felt eerily still, as though holding its breath alongside him. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, breaking the silence momentarily. Then everything went quiet again. Hours passed. His eyelids grew heavy, but he forced himself to stay alert. Sleep was a luxury he couldn't afford, not when Sophie's safety depended on him. Not when Nash lurked just across the street, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. But Emma was already dialing, her free hand clutching Sophie's rabbit tightly. Through the baby monitor, they could hear Sophie beginning to stir, demanding her comfort toy with increasing distress. Officer Wilson arrived 20 minutes later, the same officer who had dismissed their previous calls. He examined the rabbit with professional detachment, his expression already set in lines of patient skepticism. The camera footage is grainy, he said, watching the screen. Could be a teenager playing pranks, or maybe the wind blew the toy out through an open window. The windows were locked, Emma insisted. They're always locked. And what about the note? Thomas asked sharply. Officer Wilson studied the paper, frowning. No obvious fingerprints. Standard printer paper. Standard black ink. Nothing we can trace. He looked up at Emma with practiced sympathy. Mrs. Baker, I understand your concern, especially given your situation. Being a single mother isn't easy. Thomas turned away, unable to watch another adult dismiss the evidence in front of them. Through the front window, he saw Nash emerging from his house, right on cue, as if he'd been waiting, watching, timing his appearance. Nash waved, all-concerned neighbor, and started across the street. Thomas watched him approach, noting how his walk matched the shadowy figure's stride perfectly. I saw the police car, Nash called as he approached. Is everything okay? Officer Wilson stepped outside to greet him, and Thomas heard the familiar exchange begin. Nash's practiced concern, his gentle questions about their welfare, his subtle hints about Emma's stress and Thomas's psychological state. Emma went upstairs to comfort Sophie, leaving Thomas alone by the security monitor. He rewound the footage again, freezing on a frame where the intruder turned slightly toward the camera. There, glinting in the infrared light, was a ring on their right hand, a distinctive signet ring. Thomas glanced out the window. Nash was gesturing as he spoke to Officer Wilson, his right hand raised to emphasize a point. The same ring caught the morning sun. Upstairs, Sophie had stopped crying. The house settled into an uneasy quiet, broken only by the murmur of adult voices outside. Nash and Officer Wilson were discussing the overactive imaginations of grieving children, the psychological toll of loss, the way fear could make people see things that weren't there. Thomas added the note to his growing collection of evidence, carefully logging the exact time and date of its discovery. Soon, he knew, Nash would find a way to come inside, to offer comfort and support to the rattled family. He would be perfect, concerned, helpful, charming. No one would notice how his eyes lingered on Sophie's window, or how his right hand, with its distinctive ring, kept straying to the camera phone in his pocket. No one except a sleepless boy who had learned that sometimes the loudest warnings came in the softest forms. A displaced toy, a simple note, a shadowy figure who moved like a neighbor in the dark. The adults would look for complicated explanations, psychological reasons behind their fears. But Thomas knew the truth was simpler and far more dangerous. The monster had just proven he could reach into Sophie's crib while they slept, and he wanted them to know it. Nash had become a constant presence in their lives. He was always there, offering help with a practiced smile that never reached his eyes, bringing groceries when Emma looked tired, collecting their mail when she worked late, suggesting he could watch Sophie to give her a break. I insist, he said one morning, standing in their kitchen with another batch of fresh muffins. You look exhausted, Emma. A few hours to yourself would do you good. Thomas watched from the doorway as his mother hesitated. The pieces of Sophie's rabbit incident had been carefully explained away by the adults, rationalized into something less threatening. But Thomas had seen how Nash's eyes lit up when Emma mentioned getting a new security system, how he'd immediately offered to help install it himself. As Nash sipped his coffee and chatted casually, Thomas noticed the way his gaze flickered toward the cameras mounted around the room. His fingers drummed lightly against the counter, the signet ring catching the light. Thomas clenched his fists. The adults might not see it yet, but he did. Nash wasn't just a neighbor. He was a predator, testing the boundaries, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And Thomas vowed to be ready when he did. But Emma was already dialing, her free hand clutching Sophie's rabbit tightly. Through the baby monitor, they could hear Sophie beginning to stir, demanding her comfort toy with increasing distress. Officer Wilson arrived 20 minutes later, the same officer who had dismissed their previous calls. He examined the rabbit with professional detachment, his expression already set in lines of patient skepticism. The camera footage is grainy, he said, watching the screen. Could be a teenager playing pranks, or maybe the wind blew the toy out through an open window. The windows were locked, Emma insisted. They're always locked. "And what about the note?" Thomas asked sharply. Officer Wilson studied the paper, frowning. "No obvious fingerprints. Standard printer paper. Standard black ink. Nothing we can trace." He looked up at Emma with practiced sympathy. "Mrs. Baker, I understand your concern, especially given your situation. Being a single mother isn't easy." Thomas turned away, unable to watch another adult dismiss the evidence in front of them. Through the front window, he saw Nash emerging from his house, right on cue, as if he'd been waiting, watching, timing his appearance. Nash waved, all-concerned neighbor, and started across the street. Thomas watched him approach, noting how his walk matched the shadowy figure's stride perfectly. "I saw the police car," Nash called as he approached. "Is everything okay?" Officer Wilson stepped outside to greet him, and Thomas heard the familiar exchange begin. Nash's practiced concern, his gentle questions about their welfare, his subtle hints about Emma's stress and Thomas's psychological state. Emma went upstairs to comfort Sophie, leaving Thomas alone by the security